Recruiters After Action Report, Submission Reference, VAR 7719 Kelvari submitted to Director Thesara Moon, Galactic Preparatory Enrollment Division, prepared by Field Recruiter 3rd Class Vethamar, Kelvari Reach Classification. Internal Review Director Moun. I understand the complaint has already reached your desk. I will not waste your time with excuses. What I will do is tell you exactly what happened, in the order it happened, so that when the review board convenes, you have my account in full before anyone else's version poisons the record. I'm aware that 6 members of the Enrollment Division have already filed objections. I'm aware that the Admissions Review Council has requested an inquiry into my field conduct. I am, frankly, past caring about any of that. What I am not past caring about is Squad 14, so here is the report, all of it. The assignment was routine, in the sense that every assignment I had received for the previous 11 cycles was routine. I was dispatched to a Class 4 agricultural planet in the outer Kelvari Administrative Zone, designated Reach 9 Minu, to identify candidates for the coming enrollment wave at the Areth Solan Preparatory Academy. Reach 9 Minu is not the kind of world that produces many candidates. Thin atmosphere, high UV, poor mineral diversity, no orbital infrastructure worth mentioning. The species resident there, I will not name them all, but they included 2 varieties of grazer descendants, a fungal hive collective, and 1 small human settlement had been on the planet for 3 to 4 generations. Nobody important went to Reach 9 Minu to recruit. That was, in fact, the only reason I was there. My supervisor at the time, senior recruiter Dolphina, had a rotation system I can only describe as punitive. She sent her newest staff to the worlds nobody else wanted. I had been field certified for 14 months. Reach 9 Minu was my 11th dead-end posting. I landed in the settlement's single flat-ground landing strip at local dawn. The strip was unpaved. I will note that in the formal record because it surprised me. Most Class 4 worlds had at least a stabilized surface, but the human settlement at Reach 9 Minu had apparently built their landing strip themselves, by hand over several decades, using compacted soil and aggregate stone. It held my shuttle's weight without difficulty. That surprised me more than the unpaved surface. The settlement coordinator, a broad human woman named Adeze, met me at the strip's edge with 2 cups of something hot. I had been prepared for a long wait. Instead, she was already there, already handing me a drink, already moving. "You're the recruiter," she said. It was not a question. "Vethamar," I confirmed, "Field Recruiter, Enrollment Division, Areth Solan Academy." She looked me over the way you look at a piece of machinery before you trust your weight to it. Kelvari are bipedal, 3-eyed, and covered in a patterned cartilaginous skin that some species find unsettling. Adeze did not appear to find anything unsettling. "We've had recruiters before," she said. "Never one from Areth Solan. That's a good school." "It is," I agreed. "I have 1 candidate for you." She said it without preamble, without apology, without any of the usual diplomatic softening. 1. He's out on the North Ridge right now running equipment checks. You can walk up or I can have him brought down, your choice. I chose to walk up, partly because I wanted to observe the settlement on the way, and partly because in my experience, a candidate you observe in their natural environment tells you more than one who's had an hour to compose themselves. The North Ridge was a 4-kilometer walk over broken terrain. I mention that because that terrain is relevant. The ridge path was unmarked, uneven, and required crossing a dry wash that had no bridge, just a series of flat soft stones someone had laid in a pattern that made the crossing manageable, if you knew how to read it. I am a field recruiter. I have walked on 47 worlds. I slipped twice on that crossing. I noticed the stones were placed with enough precision that someone who crossed it daily would not slip at all. I made a note. The candidate was at the top of the ridge with a piece of agricultural machinery that had apparently seized during the previous day's work cycle. It was a large machine, a soil tiller of some kind, not Kelvari manufacture, not any manufacturer I recognized. He was lying underneath it. "Daniel Ozzy?" I called. From under the machine came a voice. "Yeah. 1 second. There was a sound of metal against metal, a short grunt, and then a sound like something releasing pressure. The machine shifted. The candidate slid out from under it, stood up, and looked at me. He was young, 22 or 23 by human reckoning, which I later confirmed, medium build. darker complexion than the settlement coordinator, with close-cropped hair, and the particular quality of stillness that I had learned, after 11 postings, to associate with people who do not waste energy. He looked at my uniform. He looked at my 3 eyes, 2 forward and 1 lateral. He looked at the emblem on my jacket, which was the Aerith Solon glyph. Aerith Solon, he said. He had not wiped his hands. There was grease on them. He did not offer to shake because he knew his hands were filthy, and he apparently decided that was fine. He just nodded instead. "You know the academy?" I asked. "My grandmother had a friend who enrolled there. A long time ago," he said. "She used to talk about it. And you?" He glanced back at the machine, then at the ridge, then at me. "I've thought about it," he said. "Not seriously. We need people here. What did you just fix?" I asked. "Nothing." He looked faintly amused. "I found the problem. Part I need is in storage. I'll pull it this afternoon and have it running before dark." I pulled out my assessment pad. "I'd like to ask you a few standard questions. May I sit?" He gestured to the machine's own running step, which was folded out and apparently at a useful height. I sat. He crossed his arms and waited. I ran the standard intake assessment. 32 questions, calibrated for the candidate's documented educational history, which in his case included home instruction, correspondence curricula, and an 18-month technical apprenticeship at a refinery on the neighboring moon. I will not reproduce all 32 questions here, but I will note the points at which his answers diverged from what I expected. Question 7 asked candidates to describe a situation in which they had to make a decision without adequate information. Most candidates described something personal or professional. He described an incident in which a fire had started in one of the settlement's storage blocks during a dust storm, and the fire suppression system had failed, and he had to decide in approximately 40 seconds how to route the community's water reserves, which were their drinking supply, in order to contain the fire without rendering the remaining water non-potable. He got it mostly right, lost about 1/3 of the reserves. Nobody died. He was 19 at the time. Question 15 asked candidates to name their greatest weakness. Most candidates said something diplomatic. He said, "I get impatient with people who don't mean what they say." He said it without apology, and then added, after a pause, "I'm working on it." Question 28 asked candidates to describe a skill they had that was not on their documented record. He said, "I can read weather by the way the wind changes on this ridge. A front comes through about 6 hours before the instruments pick it up. I know the timing well enough to plan around it." I asked him how long it had taken to learn that. "About 3 years," he said. "You fail a few harvests, you pay attention." By question 32, I had already decided. I want to be clear about that for the record, Director. This was not a post hoc rationalization. I decided during the field assessment, before any of what followed, that Daniel Osi was the candidate I had come to Reichishninu to find. The difficulty was that he was human. I want to be precise about what that difficulty actually was. It was not, as senior recruiter Dal Fenna later characterized it, a regulatory oversight or an enthusiasm-driven procedural error. The Aerith Solon Preparatory Academy does not formally prohibit the enrollment of human candidates. What it does, what every admissions document, internal policy memo, and unwritten guideline does, is describe the human enrollment pathway as active but limited by documented attrition concerns. What that means, in practice, is that no recruiter in the division's 40-year history had enrolled a human candidate from an outer-reach agricultural settlement for the Academy's primary program, not because it was forbidden, because nobody had. I submitted the enrollment packet that evening from the shuttle. I flagged it with every notation the system required. I listed his scores, which were in the 73rd percentile overall, with a manual technical skills assessment that the system actually returned an error on, because the scoring ceiling for that category was calibrated for species with more manipulator appendages than humans have, and he had apparently maxed it. I noted the error. I noted his scores on the reasoning and crisis response sections. I submitted the flag requesting an outer reach candidate exception, which is an actual formal process, not something I invented. And then I went to sleep in my shuttle, because it was late. The enrollment packet cleared in 6 days. I know, because I was still on Reach 9 Minu doing supplementary assessment for 2 fungal collective candidates. neither of whom ultimately enrolled, which is perhaps its own comment on the division's priorities when the confirmation came through. I walked back to the settlement. I found Daniel in the field, which is where he usually was in the morning. He was already out there when I arrived, running equipment alongside 3 other settlement workers, all of them moving with the particular efficiency of people who have done the same work together for years. I called to him. He looked up, read my expression, and walked over. "You're in," I said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked back at the field. "Term starts in 11 weeks, I said. "The travel voucher will cover the transit from Reach 9 Minu to the Erith Solon approach corridor." "I know," he said. "I already checked the transit schedules." He looked at me. "You thought I wasn't going to get in." I decided not to lie to him. There was a non-trivial chance the packet would be declined. "But you submitted it anyway." "I did," he nodded slowly. "Why?" "This is the part of the report, Director, where I am going to be honest in a way that may not reflect well on my professional objectivity." I said to him, "Because the Academy has 100 ways to identify candidates who follow instructions correctly. It has almost no way to identify candidates who figure out things that aren't in the instructions. You're the second kind." I paused. "Also, you maxed the manual assessment. The system thought it was a scoring error. It wasn't." He was quiet again. "Then, I'll need to talk to Adeze. The settlement needs." "I spoke with her," I said. "She has candidates for the apprenticeship pipeline. She told me, and I am quoting her exactly, 'He's been ready to go for 2 years. I've been waiting for someone to take him.'" That was when he laughed. It was brief and real, and I noted it because in 3 months of following this case through enrollment induction and the opening weeks of the Academy's first-term trials, it was one of only 4 times I heard him laugh like that, freely, without reservation. The first term at Erith Solon Preparatory Academy opens with what the Academy's literature calls the cohort bonding protocol. What the cadets call it, once they are past the first week and feel safe enough to use informal language in their dormitory corridors, is, depending on species, some variation of the sorting. You are placed in a squad of 12. You live with that squad. You eat with them, train with them, compete with them, and occasionally genuinely dislike them for the duration of your preparatory year. The Academy believes that adversity shared builds unit cohesion faster than any designed team-building exercise. This is, as far as I can tell from 11 cycles of watching it, correct. Squad 14's composition that year was 4 Druvan cadets, a species of hexapodal hunters from the mid-reaches, aggressive social hierarchy, pack-bonded, 2 Selin twins, technically 1 organism in 2 bodies, who had enrolled under a special bilateral candidacy provision, 3 Yanari, who are tall, quiet, excellent at navigation, and intensely status-conscious, 1 Kelvari cadet named Res, who was, unexpectedly, from my own home reach and whom I would later learn had been told by his family that a human would be in his squad, and Daniel Osi. I was not present for the first meeting. I learned about it afterward, in pieces from multiple sources, which is why I can reconstruct it with confidence. The squad assembled in their assigned dormitory bay on the second evening of orientation. The Druvan had already claimed the best sleeping positions, not because anyone had given them permission, but because they had simply moved first and nobody had objected. The Yanari had arranged themselves in a cluster. The Selin twins were sitting at the room's central table, both halves of them facing the door. Res was standing near the window, and Daniel was unpacking his kit with the methodical efficiency of someone who had packed and unpacked many times before and had a system. One of the Druvan, a cadet named Geth, who would become, by the end of the year, Daniel's closest ally in the squad, though neither of them knew that yet, said something to the group in Druvan that translated approximately as, "The human is going to struggle." He said it in Druvan because he thought Daniel couldn't understand it. Daniel finished folding a piece of clothing, placed it in the rack, and said, in passable Druvan, "You're probably right," he said it, without looking up, "but so will everyone. First term is designed to break people. The question is whether we break alone or together." Geth stared at him. "My Druvan isn't fluent," Daniel added, "in Galactic Common now. But I studied the basics. 8 weeks on transit gave me time." Silence. Then one of the Yanari cadets, a female named Sue, who would later become the squad's top navigation scorer, said, You studied Druven for this posting? Druven and Selen, a little Yanari. Didn't have time for Kelvari. He glanced at Res. Sorry. Res told me about this conversation much later. He said his first reaction was to feel professionally offended on behalf of his species that the human had not prioritized Kelvari. His second reaction, which arrived within the same breath, was that the human spent 8 weeks in transit studying 4 languages because he had expected to need them. He told me he didn't say anything at the time. He just went back to looking out the window, but he stopped leaning away from the room. That was the first week. The second week brought the Academy's first formal trial, the Orientation Navigation Challenge, in which squads are dropped into a simulated wilderness environment, a large sealed terrain dome with minimal equipment, and told to reach a designated extraction point before a time limit expires. The challenge is not, as it appears, primarily about navigation. It is about whether a group of strangers who do not fully trust each other can establish a functional command structure quickly enough to make coordinated decisions. Most first-year squads take between 14 and 18 hours for the crossing. The record at that time was 11 hours and 4 minutes, set 6 years prior. Squad 14 completed the crossing in 9 hours and 38 minutes. I want to be very careful about how I describe this, because the review board is going to look for evidence that I am inflating Daniel's contribution, and I am not. The crossing was a squad effort. Sue's navigational instincts were exceptional and got them aligned early. The Druven, all 4 of them, had an efficiency at moving through difficult terrain that reduced the squad's overall travel time significantly. The Selen twins navigated every decision that required simultaneous observation of 2 separate problem sets, which came up 4 times in the crossing, and 4 times the twins were right. Res identified a water source that saved the squad from a significant time loss in the crossing's 3rd quarter. Daniel's contribution was different. It was coordination. From the moment the squad cleared the dome's entry zone, he did not lead from the front. He did not claim authority he hadn't been granted. What he did was notice and name and route. When Geth's hunting instincts took him 20 meters off the navigational line to investigate a sound, Daniel said quietly, "Geth, we need you on the line." Not a criticism, just a calibration. When the Yanari Alft cluster began deferring to Sue's navigation to the point of not contributing their own observations, he said, "I'm getting weather off the dome's east wall." Anyone else reading the convection patterns? He wasn't. He had made it up. But 3 Yanari immediately began scanning the east wall, found an actual temperature differential that Sue incorporated into their route, and the Yanari cluster never went passive again. When Res found the water source, Daniel said, loud enough for the full squad to hear, "Res found water, good eyes." That was all. But I have watched enough cohort groups to know that 4 words at the right moment can shift who a group believes belongs there. The squad crossed in 9 hours and 38 minutes. The proctor logged it without comment. The Academy updated the record board. 3 days later, the senior proctor for first-year orientation, a Druven female named Commandant Tethval, called me into her office. "You submitted the human," she said. "I did." She looked at me the way Adeze had looked at me, measuring. On what basis? He maxed the manual assessment. The system thought it was an error. It wasn't. And he answered question 15 honestly. What did he say? That he gets impatient with people who don't mean what they say, and that he's working on it. Commandant Tethval was quiet for a moment. Then she said he didn't lead the crossing. No, he also didn't follow. He coordinated. She said it the way you say something that requires categorization you don't yet have a category for. We don't have a metric for that in first-year assessment. I know we might need one. That conversation lasted 11 minutes. I did not record it at the time because it was informal. I am reproducing it here from memory, Director, because I believe it is relevant. Kelvari's questions about whether Daniel's continued enrollment had any institutional endorsement. Commandant Tethval did not file a recommendation, but she also did not file an objection. I note the distinction. The second formal trial of first term came in week 6. The Academy calls it the Cascade Protocol. Cadets are placed in a crisis scenario with incomplete information and forced to make consequential decisions under time pressure. The scenario varies by year. That year's scenario involved a simulated structural failure in a station habitat with multiple casualty categories. Requiring triage and prioritization, the scoring system awards points for lives saved and deducts for lives lost due to decision error. It is designed to have no perfect solution. The point is to force cadets to make imperfect decisions quickly rather than perfect decisions too late. Squad 14 went in together. 13 minutes and 40 seconds in, their primary decision maker, Geth, who had naturally assumed that role based on the Druven pack hierarchy that the squad had been gravitating toward, locked. This is the term the Academy uses when a cadet stops making decisions, locks. Geth had information overload. 3 simultaneous casualty categories, 2 of which were contradictory in terms of resource allocation, and a 4th category that was ambiguous about whether intervention would help or accelerate the harm. Geth locked. What happened next is documented in the trial's observation log, which I have reviewed. Daniel said, "Geth, give me the 2 you're sure about." He didn't ask who was in command. He didn't announce that he was taking over. He just asked Geth for what Geth could provide. Geth gave him the 2 certain casualty categories. Daniel triaged those, assigned 2 of the Druven cadets to each, and said, "Yanari on the 3rd, Selen on the 4th, you can be in 2 places at once." Then to Geth, "What does your read say about the corridor?" Geth shook himself out of the lock. "Unstable, don't use it. Then we route around." Daniel nodded once. "We're behind by 40 seconds, move." They were behind by 40 seconds. They made it up in the next 4 minutes by executing the revised route without a single hesitation. Final score, 87 of a possible 100, the highest in the cohort's 4 squads. The Academy average for first-year Cascade Protocol was 61. I will note for the record, Director, that I was not present for the Cascade Protocol. I learned about it from Commandant Teth Val's written assessment, from Geth's own account, which he gave me voluntarily and without solicitation when I visited the Academy for my quarterly check-in, and from the observation log. I did not coach Daniel before the trial. I did not brief him on the scenario. I did not do anything that could be categorized as providing an enrolled candidate with improper advantage. What I did do, in my initial recruitment conversation, was tell him that the Academy had almost no way to identify candidates who figure out things that aren't in the instructions. He had apparently filed that away. By week 9, Squad 14 had stopped being 12 individuals who happened to sleep in the same bay. I am aware that this sounds like the kind of statement a recruiter who has become personally invested in his candidate's cohort would say, and I accept that characterization. I was invested. But I am also a trained field observer, and what I observed was not sentiment, it was function. The Druven who operated on pack hierarchy had incorporated Daniel into that hierarchy at a position that had no formal Druven name, but that Geth later described to me as the one who sees what the pack misses. This is not a subordinate role. It is not a command role. In Druven social structure, it is the role held by the pack member who other pack members listen to when the dominant member is overloaded, which, in the Academy's trial structure, happened constantly. The Druven had adapted their social architecture to include a human, and they had done it without anyone telling them to. The Yanari had stopped performing status. This requires explanation. Yanari are intensely status conscious, and in multi-species environments, they spend significant social energy on demonstrations of relative ranking. By week 9, Sue had stopped performing sets entirely when the squad was operating. She still performed it in the broader cohort, in the dining hall, in cross-squad interactions, but within Squad 14, she had simply stopped. When I asked her about it later, she said, "OC doesn't care about rank displays. When you perform for him, you get nothing back, so you stop. And then you realize the performing was taking time you could use for the actual work." The Selen twins had developed a habit of orienting both their bodies toward Daniel when he was speaking, which in Selen social communication is an indicator of what their species calls resonance attention, a level of listening that exceeds polite engagement. I mention this because it is not a common default behavior for Selen toward non-Selen, and because both twins later told me, in their characteristic simultaneous way, he talks like he's always thinking about the next problem while he's solving the current one. We can hear both. And Res, my fellow Kelvari, who had been told by his family that a human would be in his squad and had arrived at the academy with. I learned this from him directly, in a conversation that took place in my shuttle when I was driving him to the transit station at the end of the year with a set of prepared responses for every way the human might embarrass himself or the squad. A list of dignified exits, polite redirections, ways to manage the liability without making it cruel. He had spent 6 weeks before enrollment constructing that contingency framework. He told me he had discarded it by the end of the 2nd week. He didn't need managing, Ress said. He said it with the particular tone my species uses for statements that we have taken a long time to arrive at. He needed the same thing the rest of us needed, someone to see what he was actually doing instead of what they expected him to be doing. He paused. You gave him that. When you put him in the packet, I want to include that in the record, Director. Not because it reflects well on me, but because it reflects accurately on what recruitment actually is when it works correctly. It is not finding the candidate who fits the existing category. It is finding the candidate who reveals that the existing category is incomplete. Week 11 was the Academy's midterm integration trial, and I will be straightforward about this part. It was the hardest thing I watched in my 11 cycles as a field recruiter. The integration trial places squads in a simulated multi-force operation, meaning they are working alongside a second squad, coordinating across species boundaries under communication restrictions. The scenario that year involved a simulated rescue operation in a hostile environment. Squad 14 was paired with Squad 7, who were significantly more cohesive by traditional metrics. Older candidates, on average, more academically decorated, 2 members who had prior military youth service from their home systems. Squad 7's assigned commander, a Druvan senior named Kresh, outranked everyone's on Squad 14 by age and prior credential. He made clear, within the first 3 minutes of the joint briefing, that he expected Squad 14 to function as a support element. His word was supplementary. He said it in Galactic Common. He said it looking at Daniel. Daniel said, "Understood. Where do you want us?" Kresh told him. Daniel went. He took Squad 14 with him, and they went to the assigned support position, and they did their assigned support function. For the first 18 minutes of the scenario, it was clear that Kresh's plan was working. The rescue elements were moving toward their objectives. The communication channels were clean. The operation was on schedule. At the 19-minute mark, Kresh's primary objective collapsed. A structural failure in the simulated environment created a cascade that invalidated the route he had planned for the final extraction. It was not a failure of intelligence or leadership. It was the scenario doing what the scenario was designed to do, which was break the plan. Kresh had one good solution and one bad solution. He identified them both in about 45 seconds, which was fast. But the good solution required using a corridor that was within Squad 14's operating area, and it required using it now, with coordination between both squads simultaneously, and Kresh had spent 18 minutes treating Squad 14 as a supplementary element that executed his instructions rather than a partner that could contribute independent judgment. He called for Daniel over the comm. "OC, I need your squad on Corridor 7 now. Direct intercept. Can you execute?" From the observation log, Daniel's response time was 2 seconds. "We're already there. Geth has the intercept. Selen are covering the secondary egress. Tell me what you need and we'll have it." There was a pause. The log records it as 4 seconds. Kresh said, "How are you already there?" Daniel said, "We heard the structure go." Geth's pack instinct told him which corridor was next. I trusted him. There is a thing that happens sometimes at the Academy. I have seen it maybe 3 times in 11 cycles, where a trial stops being a trial and becomes something real, not dangerous. Simulated environments are safe, but real in the sense that the people inside it stop performing for the scoring system and start actually solving the problem in front of them. The integration trial that year became real at exactly that moment. Kresh stopped treating Daniel as a supplementary element. Squad 14 stopped deferring to Squad 7 as the primary. They ran the final 12 minutes as a single operational unit, and the combined squad extracted all simulated casualties with a score of 94 out of 100. The proctor who ran the evaluation noted in his report that the performance had been unusual in structure, marked by an absence of visible rank negotiation during the critical phase, which is atypical for multi-squad integration trials at this level. He flagged it for the Academy's Training Review Committee as a case study. I do not know if they acted on it. I have not followed up, because by then I had other concerns. What I had was the formal complaint from senior recruiter Dolfena, filed in week 12 of Daniel's first term, arguing that my submission of a human candidate from an outer reach agricultural settlement had constituted a misapplication of the outer reach candidate exception, and that the packet should have been escalated to a committee rather than processed through my field authority. I will note for the record that the packet was processed through my field authority because the outer reach candidate exception formally permits field recruiter discretion in low-populated world submissions. I did not circumvent the process. I used the process. The difference between those two things is precisely what the review board exists to determine. What Dolfena's complaint actually was, as I read it, was an argument that human candidates from agricultural settlements should not be a category that field recruiters are empowered to act on alone. That is a legitimate policy argument. She is entitled to make it. I have made the opposite argument in this report. The review board will decide between them. I am less interested in the policy argument, Director, than I am in asking you to read the following before you reach your conclusions. At the end of first term, which Daniel completed, which I note because the documented attrition concerns in the admissions policy are based on historical dropout rates, and he did not drop out. The squad held a dinner in their dormitory bay. Not a formal occasion, informal. The Druven brought something they had prepared from their own ration supplies. The Yanari brought a navigation game they played competitively, but had modified for mixed species play. The Selen twins brought both halves of themselves and a story they told simultaneously, each half narrating from a different perspective, which I am told was quite funny. Ress brought a Kelvari tea blend from his personal stock. Daniel brought nothing, because he had not known the dinner was happening until an hour before, because the squad had planned it as a surprise. For him. The reason it was a surprise is that it was also the anniversary, by Academy calendar, of the day Abu walked up the North Ridge on Reach 9 Minu and sat down on a machine's running step and asked him 32 questions. They had found this out, apparently, from Ress, who had asked me for the date in a comm message 3 weeks prior that I had not suspected was connected to anything. I was not at the dinner. I heard about it afterward from Geth, who gave me the fullest account in Druven, which I want to note his approval for before I reproduce it here. Geth is not by nature a sentimental individual. He is a Druven pack hunter who scored in the 91st percentile on combat simulation assessments and once carried an injured squad member 4 kilometers through simulated terrain without being asked, simply because the squad member needed carrying. But he described the dinner in detail, and he told me 2 things that I want in this report. The first was that when Daniel realized what the dinner was and why it was happening, he sat down at the table and was quiet for a moment. Just quiet. And then he said, and Geth remembered it precisely because he had been studying Galactic Common Idiom that week and found it confusing. I thought I was coming to the Academy alone. The second was that Sue said from across the table, "You were, now you're not." That is the after-action report, Director Maun. I submitted 1 enrollment packet on 1 human candidate from 1 outer reach agricultural settlement under the formal provisions of the outer reach candidate exception as written. I believed I was right to do so. I still believe that. The review board will decide whether the procedural question matters more than the outcome. But I want to end this report with a request, not a defense. If the review board finds against my submission method and recommends a formal mark on my field record, I accept that outcome. I am not asking for clemency. I am asking for one operational decision that is within your authority as division director to grant without board approval. I am asking to be reassigned as Squad 14's permanent field liaison for the duration of their academy enrollment. I recognize that field recruiters are not typically assigned ongoing liaison roles with enrolled candidates. I recognize that what I am asking for is unusual. I recognize that it could be read as evidence that my objectivity in this case was compromised from the beginning. I would argue, instead, that it is evidence of exactly the thing that makes a field recruiter worth keeping in the field. I know which candidates matter, and I know when something is happening that the system does not have a category for yet. Squad 14 is something the system does not have a category for yet. I am asking for the chance to document it. I am asking because those 12 cadets, 13 counting me at the outer edge, the one who saw them before they were a squad, have, without anyone designing this outcome, without any formal protocol for it, built something in 1 year that most units spend a decade trying to manufacture. I have done this for 11 cycles. I have enrolled candidates from 47 worlds. I have never watched a squad do what Squad 14 did. I have also, if I am being honest with you in a way that field reports rarely permit, never felt the particular sensation of belonging to something that I have felt in the quarterly visits to that dormitory bay, in the conversations with Res about Kelvari tea and what it means to be from the Reach, in the moment when Geth called me to describe the dinner, and his voice in Druvan had the particular resonance that my species xenolinguistics courses describe as pack warmth, which Druvan do not typically direct toward non-Druvan, and which I had been too focused on my professional concerns to notice he had been directing toward me for weeks. The human I recruited from the North Ridge on Reach 9 Menu was right about one thing from the very beginning. The question is never whether you will struggle. The question is whether you struggle alone or together. I have spent 11 cycles struggling alone. I would like, with your permission, to try the other way. Respectfully submitted, Field Recruiter 3rd Class Vethamar Kelvari Reach, Enrollment Division Arith Solon Preparatory Academy Field Office Addendum, appended 7 days after submission. Permission granted. Recruiter Vethamar. Report accepted. Reassignment authorized. The review board found no procedural violation. The outer reach exception was applied correctly. Senior Recruiter Dal Fenna's complaint has been noted and filed. For what it is worth, and I say this off the formal record as one Kelvari to another, I read your report twice. The second time, I read the part about the dinner, and the part about the Druvan's pack warmth, and the part about struggling alone. You wrote a good report, but what you actually wrote was a better reason. Welcome to Squad 14. Director Thesara Moon, Galactic Preparatory Enrollment Division, Supplementary Field Notes. Recruiter Vethamar filed concurrently with the above. Report at Director Mound's request following her initial review. These notes cover observations from weeks 3 through 10 that were omitted from the formal report for brevity. The director has indicated they are relevant to the reassignment decision. I include them without further editing. Week 3 at the Academy brings what is officially called the Physical Readiness Assessment. This is perhaps the most straightforward of the first-term evaluations in that it measures what it says it measures. Physical capability, calibrated by species. Each cadet is assessed against the published baseline for their biology, and scores reflect their deviation from that baseline. A score of 100 means you performed exactly as your species baseline predicts. A score above 100 means you exceeded it. Below, and you did not. Human physical baselines in the Academy's assessment documentation are drawn from a dataset that is, I have since confirmed, approximately 40 years old. They were calibrated against human candidates who enrolled during a period when the Academy's human outreach program was more active, before the documented attrition concerns curtailed it. Those candidates were, for the most part, drawn from established human academic institutions, not from outer reach agricultural settlements, where the physical demands of daily work include lifting, hauling, climbing, and operating machinery in variable gravity conditions for 12 to 14 hours at a stretch. Daniel's physical readiness assessment score was 141. The proctor logged it and then, according to Res, stared at the number for nearly a full minute before noting in the margin, BASAM calibration may require update for outer reach settlement populations. I want to note for the record that I did not know this when I submitted the enrollment packet. It was a pleasant discovery. What was less pleasant for the review board to consider, not for Daniel, was what happened in the assessment's final component, which involves a load carry over a set course. The weight used is calibrated by species, so each cadet carries a standardized challenge relative to their biology. The course is timed. Daniel finished the course in the third fastest time in the cohort. The two cadets who finished faster were both Druven, and their finish times were 3 and 5 seconds ahead of his respectively. Zeth's was 5 seconds ahead. When Daniel crossed the line, Geth was waiting. He said something in Druven. Daniel said something back in Druven. Neither Ress nor Sue, who were both nearby, could hear exactly what was exchanged. But Rest described Geth's expression afterward as the look a pack member gives when they have recalibrated an estimate substantially upward. From that day, according to every account I received, the Druven cadets stopped sitting at the end of the table in the dormitory. They moved closer. Not next to Daniel, Geth took the seat adjacent, but noticeably closer. In Druven social architecture, proximity to the pack center is not casual. You do not move closer to the center unless you have been granted permission, implicitly or explicitly. The Druven had granted it to Daniel. I mention this because I think the review board needs to understand that what happened in Squad 14 was not a diplomatic exercise or a sensitivity protocol or a managed multicultural experience. It was a pack of 6-limbed hunters from the mid-reaches deciding, on their own terms and by their own criteria, that a human from an agricultural settlement belonged near the center of what they were building. Nobody organized that. Nobody incentivized it. It simply happened because Daniel was Daniel and because Geth trusted what he had seen. Week 4 brought the Academy's written curriculum component, and here I must be more careful about what I claim. Daniel was not the top scorer in the cohort on the written assessments. He was not in the top quartile. He was mid-range, consistently, which placed him in a cohort that included candidates from species whose educational systems were significantly more advanced in certain theoretical domains than anything available on Reach 9 menu. Galactic Common Linguistics, Xenobiology Foundations, Advanced Mathematics for Multidimensional Navigation. These were subjects he was encountering for the first time in any formal context. He did not club about this. He did not ask for remediation or additional support, which the Academy offers and which several other first-year cadets in various squads were using regularly. What he did was study. Ress told me that on 3 separate occasions he had woken in the middle of the Academy's night cycle and found Daniel at the common table with 3 or 4 text access pads open simultaneously, cross-referencing between them, making notes in a small physical notebook he had apparently brought from Reach 9 menu, working through material at a pace that Ress described as methodical, not fast, but nothing ever had to be looked up twice. By week 8, his written scores had moved from the 47th percentile to the 63rd. By the end of first term, they were at the 71st. He was not going to be the top academic performer in his squad. He was not aiming to be. What he was doing was closing the gap, systematically and without drama, until it was no longer a liability. Sue told me about week 5, when she found him in the navigation classroom, not during a scheduled session, just there, in an empty room, working through a star chart problem on one of the holographic displays. She had come to retrieve a data pad she had left behind. She stopped in the doorway. He was working on a problem she recognized from the third-year curriculum, which the Academy posts on its open access system because theoretical exposure is not restricted. He was working through it wrong. The methodology he was using was a reasonable approximation, but was missing a variable that the simplified outer reach transit systems he had used for travel calculations would not have required. She could have left. She had her datapad. Instead, she said, that approach works for sublight routing. At superluminal, you need to account for frame drag in the... And then she stopped herself, because she had been about to explain something to a first-year cadet from an agricultural world, and some vestige of Yanari status performance had made her hesitate over whether this was appropriate to her standing. Daniel looked up. He looked at the display, then at her. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to understand why the simpler approach fails before I learn the correction. It helps me remember it." Sue stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she came in and sat down and spent 40 minutes explaining frame drag notation for superluminal navigation. She told me later that she had not enjoyed anything as much in the entire first term as those 40 minutes, because she had been explaining things to someone who was not performing comprehension, who was actually grappling, in real time, with the moments where his existing model broke. and finding them interesting rather than embarrassing. He learns like he knows he will eventually understand, she said. Most cadets who are behind learn like they are afraid of being found out. They are different experiences to teach. I include this in the supplementary notes because I believe it is relevant to something that the formal report only describes in outline, the specific mechanism by which Squad 14 became what it became. Daniel did not bond the squad through charisma or through dominance or through some quality of exceptional specialness. He bonded them by being exactly what he was, a person who was genuinely interested in what other people knew, genuinely willing to be wrong, and genuinely present in the room rather than performing for whatever assessment was watching. The Selin twins described it to me later in their characteristic simultaneous fashion. One half said, "He makes you feel that what you know is worth knowing." The other half said, "And he makes you feel that what you don't know yet is just a matter of time." I had, by week 9, stopped telling myself that my quarterly check-ins were purely professional. The quarterly visit involved transit from the division's regional office to the academy, a formal check-in with the first-year enrollment coordinator, a review of each enrolled candidate's progress metrics, and a brief informal contact with the candidate to confirm their welfare and address any concerns. For most of my enrolled candidates across 11 cycles, the informal contact was a brief conversation in a neutral space, a corridor, an admin waiting area, lasting perhaps 10 minutes. I provided information about division resources. The candidate confirmed they had no outstanding issues. We exchanged formal courtesies. I departed. My quarterly visit to Aerith Solon in week 9 lasted 4 hours. I will not attempt to justify this in the formal report. But in the supplementary notes, I can say what actually happened. I met with Daniel in the coordinator's waiting area as planned. He told me the squad had set the crossing record in week 2. He told me the Cascade protocol score. He told me, with the particular careful neutrality of someone choosing their words, that Geth had said something to him in week 3 after the load carry that he had only partially understood because his Druvan wasn't that good yet, but that Res had translated for him, and that it was one of the more meaningful things anyone had said to him in his life. I asked what it was. He said Geth had said, "You carry your weight. A pack carries weights together. You are in the pack." I was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel said, "Is it all right if I ask you to come meet the squad? Not formally, just, they know who you are. They know you submitted the packet. Res talks about you." And I think, he paused, "I think it would be good for them to meet the person who started this." I went. I spent 3.5 hours in the Squad 14 dormitory bay, drinking Kelvari tea that Res had made, and that was, I should note for the record, significantly better than the tea available at the division's regional office. I watched the Selin twins demonstrate their simultaneous narration story for me, which had apparently become a squad tradition. I watched Geth and Daniel run through a tactical problem on the floor using objects from the dormitory, a practice the Druvan used for spatial planning, while Sue critiqued the navigation and the other Yanari argued with her. I sat with Res by the window and we talked about home. I should clarify that for the record. We talked about the Kelvari reach, about what it is to be from the outer administrative zones where the resources are thin and the postings are considered punishment assignments, about how you learn, out there, to make things work with what you have rather than waiting for resources that may not come. Res had grown up in a settlement not entirely unlike Reach 9 Minu's human community. Not identical, his family were Kelvari, with Kelvari social structures, but with the same fundamental texture, a small community, limited outside contact, high daily functional demands, and a deep competence at the specific problems their world presented that did not translate neatly into any standardized assessment category. He said, "I thought I was the unusual one in this squad, the Reach kid among the proper system candidates." He was quiet for a moment, then he showed up. I said, and I realized I had been using the wrong frame. I was looking at what was different. He was looking at what we could do together. He paused again. "I think he learned that in a field. I think it's a farming thing. You don't get to decide what the weather is going to be. You decide what you do with the weather you have." That was week 9. Weeks 10 and 11 I have covered in the formal report. Week 12 I have described only in outline, And I want to add one detail here that I omitted there for reasons of length. When the integration trial ended, when the combined squad's final score of 94 was logged and the simulation environment powered down, the Academy protocol is for the squads to debrief separately, reviewing their individual performance with their proctors before a joint debrief that identifies cross-squad coordination lessons. The proctors were gathering their squads. Squad 14 was moving toward their proctor's station. Kresh was moving toward his. Kresh stopped. He turned around. He crossed the distance to Daniel and held out one of his forward limbs, which is the Druven gesture that corresponds to offering something. He didn't have anything in the limb. The gesture was the point. Daniel looked at the extended limb. He looked at Kresh. He extended his own hand, and they held that contact for a moment, the Druven gesture meeting the human one. Kresh said, "Your squad is good." Daniel said, "Your plan was good. We just got lucky that the structure went when it did." Kresh said, "It wasn't luck." Daniel said, "No, but it's better if you think it was. I was told about this exchange by two independent sources, Sue, who was nearby, and one of Squad 7's Yanari cadets, who had also observed it. I include it here because I think it is the most efficient single description of what Daniel Osi is as an operator and as a person. He took the win, and then he handed Kresh a narrative that made the collaboration rather than competition the lasting result. Kresh did not know he had just been given something. Daniel did not need him to know. That is what I enrolled. That is what the Outer Reach candidate exception was designed to capture, and what 40 years of disuse had caused the system to forget it could find. I stand by the report. I stand by the request. End of supplementary field notes. One more thing, Director, that I did not include in either the formal report or the supplementary notes, because it does not belong in either, being neither procedurally relevant nor strictly an observation. It is a personal accounting, and I include it here only because you read the report twice and wrote what you wrote, and I believe you would want the complete picture. On the morning I submitted the enrollment packet for Daniel Ose, sitting in my shuttle on the unpaved landing strip at Reach 9 Minu, while the local sun was still low and orange over the ridgeline, I made a note in my personal field log, not the official log, the small one I keep for the things that do not fit in the official documentation. The note said, "Submitted the human, do not know if it will clear. Believe it should." That is all it said. I did not write that I expected what followed. I did not write that I imagined he would set records or 94 on a multi-squad integration trial or become the structural center of a cross-species cohort in a single academic year. I wrote that I believed the packet should clear. That was the full extent of my prediction. But there is something I have not told anyone, not Res, not Commandant Teth Val, not the enrollment coordinator, about why I walked up that ridge in the first place, instead of having Daniel brought down. I said it was to observe the settlement. That is true, but the fuller truth is this: I had been on 11 dead-end postings. I had enrolled candidates who fit the categories correctly and watched them proceed through the academy systems without incident and without distinction, and I had driven back to my shuttle afterward with the particular hollow competence of someone who has done their job precisely and accomplished nothing of consequence. I had started to wonder if the categories were the problem, if the system of finding and the system of sorting were calibrated to produce safety rather than something worth producing. The North Ridge was 4 kilometers of broken terrain. I slipped twice. I noticed the stones in the crossing, and I made a note, and the note was not in the official's log. The note was, someone's laid those stones for the crossing, probably years ago. Nobody from off-world would know how to read them. The person who laid them is still doing it. I went up that ridge because I had a theory, and the theory was, the person who laid those stones is still doing it. And I wanted to know if that person was worth putting in a packet. He was lying under a machine when I arrived. That's the whole story, Director. The formal report is accurate. The supplementary notes are accurate. And this last part, this is just the thing that a field recruiter from the outer Kelvari Reach needed to tell someone before the review board, makes it a matter of official record, and the personal parts get filed away. I walked up a ridge on a world nobody important visited, in an assignment that was meant to go nowhere, and I found something the system did not have a category for. I've spent 11 cycles looking for that. I did not know I was looking, but when I found it, I recognized it. Squad 14, Director. Welcome me to it.